I moved into the building because it felt anonymous in exactly the way I wanted. A narrow 5-story walk-up with a brass plaque that read Studio A on my door, and a lobby camera that blinked blue like an indifferent eye. The landlord was kind in the manner of people who sell leases, polite, hands folded, the sort of man whose smile belonged in brochures. The apartment itself was honest. Small kitchen, a window that looked over the back alley where the city kept its leftover breath, a threadbare armchair that fit my body like a glove. I liked routine. I liked that the elevator never worked, and that the hallway light on the 3rd floor hummed in a low, neighborly tone. I liked that nobody ever knocked after midnight. I worked nights, so my rhythm was different from most of the building. I'd go to the office at dusk, come home when most people were half asleep, and fall into the thin, obedient hours of the morning. The job was mostly code and coffee and the occasional client call across time zones. It gave me fragments of the world that other people lived in, little shards I could piece into long, quiet hours at home. I told myself it was a peaceful life. I told myself that a lot of things. You tell yourself narratives long enough, and they start to feel like truth. The camera in the lobby became a kind of companion. It was mounted high, its small black eye always angled a degree or two downwards, catching shoes and the flutter of coats. The landlord told me the footage was kept for 30 days before it looped, standard security protocol. At first I watched the footage for practical reasons. Someone had taken to leaving small garbage bags in the stairwell, and I wanted to note a pattern. Then I watched it because watching was an idle obsession. The camera made the building legible. It reduced people to movements and schedules. It made the anonymous into evidence. On the Tuesday before everything began, I was home before dawn. I came in, tossed my keys on the little dish by the door, and boiled water for tea. It was the kind of morning a person can feel in their bones, an afterglow of city noise and the smell of exhaust and lemon cleaner. I remember standing in the small square of kitchen light with the kettle rising and thinking about a line of code that would not work. The apartment felt especially quiet, good quiet. I drank my tea, checked email, and at 1:30 a.m., I lay down, fully dressed, on the couch. I told myself I would nap for 40 minutes, and then work again. 40 minutes folded into waking at 3:15, heart steady. I made sense of the time in the sterile light from my phone, and then I slept again. I do not remember leaving the building. The next morning, I walked past the landlord in the hallway, and he said, almost casual, "You're a night walker, huh?" and laughed as a way of containing some other meaning. He handed me a small folded envelope and told me nothing else. Inside the envelope was a single printout, a still from the lobby camera, time-stamped at 2:04 a.m., full in blocky numbers. It showed the door of Studio A, opening and a figure leaving, the corridor light silhouetting them. I studied the printout as if the image might sharpen into explanation. The figure's shape was my shape, the slope of the shoulders, the way my jacket hung. My keys were clearly visible in the pocket. My face, however, was turned just enough that the camera could not resolve it. In the image, my head was bowed like a man who was either walking away or being guided. I held the paper for longer than felt reasonable. There were so many small things that did not line up. I had been home at 3:15. I had woken, I had coffee on the counter. The print was time-stamped at 2:04. Even as I said the numbers into myself, they felt like someone else's notes. I asked the landlord where he had found the printout. He shrugged and said, "Security office. There was some interest. Thought you might want to see." He left the rest as a polite puzzle and closed his door with a soft politeness that became rancid in my mouth. I went home and booted the old laptop. The security system had a web portal the landlord provided during move-in, user-friendly, password-protected, and maddeningly democratic about what it showed. I logged in and clicked to the archived footage. 30 days of hallway life, compressed into thumbnails, each an hour, a moment, a blink. For a ridiculous animal reason, I felt a bead of expectation build, some private hope that the camera had made a mistake and that my reality would be protected by the right frame. The feed loaded reluctantly, as if it were a thing that could be consulted but not trusted. I found the hour of 2. The images melted and lined up, and there I was at 2:04, the door swinging open, the same figure leaving, my jacket, the same backpack, the small, deliberate gait. I had imagined that if I watched enough frames, moving forward and back and slowing the playback, I would find the missing act, me returning home at 2:05, putting down coffee, the small, ordinary acts of my life that would stitch the night back into a normal seam. There was no seam. The camera saw my departure. It did not show my return. I scanned the rest of the building like a man looking for cracks in a story. The neighbor across the hall left for work at 6. A young woman on the second floor left at 2:07. A courier passed at 2:12. Someone left the building at 1:58 and returned at 2:10. None of it explained me walking out at 2:04 when I would later insist, with no memory, that I had been home for hours. I printed the frames. There is a peculiar thing about having a photograph. It converts the world into an accusation. The paper was warm beneath my fingers, and the shape on it was familiar in a way that made my throat close. I annotated the margin like a detective might. Times, angles, the lack of reflection, the way my left arm hung loose, my head down. If I squinted, I could convince myself the print showed the shape of a second presence, a shadow, perhaps a person behind me. But the frames around it did not show anyone else. They were blank hallways, and a trash bag that had been left at the base of the stair. I told myself the rational stories. Sleepwalking happened. Alcohol does the same. But I had not had alcohol. Maybe someone had taken my keys and used them to stage something I would not remember. Maybe the building had a glitch, a timestamp error, a miscalibrated clock. I am very good at building rational scaffolding when reality tilts. I am also very good at lying to myself. I installed a cheap camera in my living room for the nights that followed. It was small and inelegant, a stick of plastic and a lens, but it filmed continuously and saved files to a little SD card. I told myself I did it to prove I was fine. I told myself I did it because the printout had left a small hollow in my chest that only more footage could fill. A week later, I watched the newly recorded footage back. There is nothing quite as humbling as seeing oneself on video, moving awkwardly through their own private life. At 1:58 a.m., I trailed through my kitchen in the pajamas I'd been wearing the prior week. Bare feet, hair a mess. The exact structural silence of a man who thinks the night is his alone. The camera saw me pick up the keys. It saw me leave. I watched the door close. I watched the image of my own hallway move past the lens and felt, with a panic that felt like vertigo, that I was watching a stranger. The audio line was thin, no footsteps in the alley, no voices. I checked the time code. On the new camera it read 1:59:03. I checked my laptop's timestamp. It said 1:59:01. There was a 1 or 2 second discrepancy, not enough to justify a whole narrative. I kept watching the clip and then, after the sensation of watching myself physically leave, I watched the last frame, my silhouette receding down the stairs, and then the image cut out. The SD card recorded no more past that point. Later, I learned that cheap cameras have blind spots. They overwrite when memory fills. Still, the whole gnawed. The days grew a gentle panic. I stopped going out when I could avoid it. I left my keys on the counter and put tape over the lock, so I would be forced to see the door if I left the trembling of the house. I asked a neighbor to check in one night, and he promised. The landlord said little. The building kept its rhythms. I might have kept mine if not for the call on a rainy Thursday. The landlord called and asked me to come down to the office. When I arrived, he had 2 prints on the desk, the 2:04 image I'd been given, and another frame from a different camera, a camera I didn't know existed, positioned in the stairwell, pointing down. The second photo was at 2:06 a.m. It showed the same figure, shoulders hunched, descending the stairs. The figure's face was clearer in this one, enough that I could see the outline of my nose, the length of my jaw. But someone else stood at the bottom of the stair, pale in the camera's light, a shape that was not a person so much as a shadow with intention. It appeared to be waiting. The waiting figure placed something in the figure's hand. The thing glinted like metal in the stair camera's poor resolution. "Do you know who that is?" the landlord asked. "I don't know," I said. "You were inside," he said then, unexpectedly personal. I watched the feed. I had not asked him to watch. He had simply checked it because a courier said he heard a person in a suit whispering downstairs. He had called security, and security had reviewed all the cameras because of an unrelated disturbance, and somewhere within that tangle, I had become a problem for someone else's curiosity. The stairwell print gave me a new terrible rhythm. For one unnerving day, I told myself the reasonable stories again. Someone had used my face to cover their own. A prank, identity theft. Then I watched the stairwell camera for the hour prior, and following my departure, and found, in frames that brightened and faded like the slow blink of a distant animal, my figure returning. At 3:41 a.m., a pale figure re-entered the building, followed 30 seconds later by a silhouette that matched me precisely, my jacket the same gait. The door closed behind them. The camera caught a hand motion, an exchange of something, and then the world above ground went blank like a curtain. The exchange object remained ambiguous in all frames. A key, a coin, metal that reflected light. In some images it looked like a tiny knife. In others it looked like an old-fashioned coin. The details were small, and my mind, not wanting a simple explanation, preferred the grotesque. I tried to be gentle with myself despite it. I wanted a benign solution. Sleepwalking, someone playing a trick, an editing error. So I did what people do when the visual world betrays them. I interviewed my memory like an unreliable witness. I sat in my living room and tried to reconstruct the night as if by logic. At 2:04, I might have left, yes. I might have met a person downstairs. I might have accepted or taken an object. I might have returned. Why then did the camera show me leaving at 2:04 and not coming back until 3:41? Why did I awaken on the couch at 3:15, already dressed? Why did the SD card cut out when I had watched it? The more I asked, the more the night condensed into a shape that refused to be pinned by reason. A friend suggested therapy. Another friend, less shrewd, said, once with an ugly, curious grin, "Maybe you're in a loop, like some sci-fi movie." He laughed. I wanted answers more than I wanted the comfort of metaphor. The landlord, for reasons he never fully explained, allowed me a look at the raw server files. They were boring in an archival way. Rows of data, timestamps, a dizzying file tree. I downloaded everything relevant. I opened reels and scrolled. At 2:04, my door opened, exactly as the print showed. At 2:05, however, under a camera angle not often used, the lens had captured something that made me hold my breath until my ribs ached. There I was again, in the frame, turned slightly to the camera, my mouth moving in a way that suggested speech. Behind me, the shadowy shape at the bottom of the stairs raised its head, and where something would have been exchanged in prior frames, a thin sliver of light flashed, too quick to be conclusive, like the brief reflection of a coin or some other small metal glint. Then the frames folded forward as if someone had hit fast forward on the world. I found a pattern. The building's footage had moments where time seemed to smear. A person's arm elongated across frames, the same coffee cup appearing twice. I asked the landlord whether the system had been repaired recently. He said yes, an upgrade a month ago. Sometimes the codec messes with the frames, he said, as if that explained the way my life had unstitched itself. It's digital, it's fickle. But the stairwell camera was old. It was redundant, mechanical, an eye that had watched the building longer than much of its tenant list. When I focused on that footage, things became stranger in a different register. At 2:04, my figure left. At 2:06, someone waited. At 3:40, I returned. There was one frame, however, that refused context. At 2:35, the stairwell camera captured a man, my face unmistakable, stepping out of the shadows and looking directly into the lens. His eyes were hollow in the grainy image, like small pits of absence. He lifted his hand and did a motion I could only understand as a knock. 1, 2, 3. The camera's internal clock hummed, and then, for a second that looked like a hesitation, the frame layered with a second image, the same frame again, but with a small, indistinct figure standing beside me, closer than any frame should allow. When I paused the video, the image jittered like a heartbeat. When I advanced it, the second figure dissolved. I printed that frame too, and the paper looked like the face of some small, absurd god. I put copies under a lamp and circled things in red. The hand, the slight slip of metal, the way the shadow bent. The act of circling felt ludicrous and necessary, as if the ink might make meaning stick where it otherwise slid away. Two things happened after that. First, I began to find small objects tucked into places I would notice only by accident. A penny pressed under my doormat. A scrap of paper folded with a single numeral written on it. 3. The penny had no year. The paper smelled faintly of metal and old bread. Second, the nights changed their temperature. At 3 in the morning, the apartment felt inhabited, thick with other breath. Sometimes in the deep quiet, I would hear a scrape at the bottom of the door, light as a fingernail. Once I heard 3 knocks, slow and patient. I did not answer. The most unsettling discovery was the way memories rearranged themselves in the weeks after the prints. A small fact. A man who has been trusted by the camera to leave his building at 2:04 and return at 3:41 will begin to notice the edges of his own day fray. I would wake and find my belt in the sink, like a token of some other ritual. I would find scuffs on the soles of my shoes where none had been. Once, in the margin of a receipt from a convenience store 3 blocks away, there was my signature, my handwriting. But the name sign below, it was not mine. One night, I stayed up for the whole small, long darkness, and I mounted my camera to the window, pointing down the stair. I played the footage live, watching the stair with the small totalitarian patience of someone documenting the world's betrayals. At 2:03 a.m., the bulb in the stairwell guttered and then brightened. At 2:04, the hallway door opened. I watched myself, in real time, step through into the corridor. I watched the shadow at the foot of the stairs, such a clear, uncanny presence, lift a hand and place something in my palm. It could have been a coin. It could have been nothing at all. I leaned forward until my face nearly touched the laptop screen. The man whose face matched mine looked at the camera and met my eyes. He raised a finger and drew, very deliberately, a number in the air, 3. When I rewound the footage and played it frame by frame, the movement stuttered and pixelated, as if the camera refused to commit to that action. When I enhanced the frame and ran the image through software, the figure's face distorted in a way that made me swallow hard. The man looked older, or perhaps wearier, or perhaps like a version of myself I had not noticed. He was my shape and my name in the same frame as an absence. 2 nights later, I walked out into the alley without going upstairs. I wanted, in the concrete way of someone scrambling for control, to meet the thing that had visited me. The city smelled of wet tar and late-night food, and I walked the block slow, searching doorways and shadowed stoops. At the bottom of the stairwell, someone had left the smallest offering, a coin on the 3rd step. It was warm. In the nights that followed, I stopped sleeping easily. There is a particular exhaustion that is less about the body than about knowledge. You know now that someone has used your shape and left a trail in your name. You know now that cameras lie in the small ways of omission. You know now that the world will allow itself to be seen and then not seen. I checked the feed one last time, a foolish ceremonial thing, and watched the looped patient footage. At 2:04, the door opened. I watched the figure move. At the bottom of the stair, a pale presence waited. The figure turned, and its face was my face. It raised a hand, and the other presence brushed its palm with something that flashed like a cheap ring. Then the figure at the stairs looked straight into the lens and smiled with my mouth and did not feel like me at all. I pressed pause. I printed that frame. I placed the print next to the little pile of objects. The coin, the paper with the single numeral, the scrape in the wood beneath the doorknob. In the photograph, my eyes are empty. In the photograph, my mouth is a thin line. The camera had recorded me the way it records everything, dispassionately, with the small cruelty of an eye. The building keeps its rhythm. The landlord still smiles politely. The camera still blinks blue. I still go to work. I still make tea. The small objects remain. A coin on the 3rd step. A scrap of paper folded with a single 3. And now a new thing. A receipt folded into quarters with my name and another name beneath it. The other name is blank. Sometimes, late, I stand in the doorway and press my palm to the wood where someone else has pressed before me. The grain is warm. It feels like a place where the world remembers your weight and decides to lend it to you for a little while. I wonder how long I can keep reminding myself of what is true. I wonder whether the camera will someday catch something that finally reads like an explanation. I wonder, with a small, bright panic, if the camera was not a recorder at all, but a conduit, a way for the building to pass people through one shape into another. If you ever come to the building, if you ever stand under the lobby camera and watch the thumbnails blink, don't trust the small generosity of an unblinking eye. It will show you something that looks like you. It will show you leaving at 2:04 a.m. and returning at 3:41. It will show you smiling into the lens and looking immediately less like yourself. And if, by some mischance, you find a penny on the 3rd stair with no year on it, put it back where you found it. Walk inside. Lock your door. Stay awake. And when the hush thickens and something knocks 3 times on the wood, do not answer. I still do not remember leaving at 2:04. I still have the prints. I still have the coin. I still sleep occasionally in clean fits. At times, I convince myself the whole thing will fold into the reasonable. At others, I catch a reflection in the window and see not myself, but a man with my face moving in a way I've never moved before. The camera recorded that man with the casual cruelty of the lens and handed the file to an indifferent hard drive. The file sits in a server somewhere, waiting until someone clicks it again, waiting perhaps to teach someone else the patient, small lesson of the stairs. You can be yourself, and you can be borrowed. Tonight, as always, the camera blinks blue.